A Chinese company spent $1 billion fixing a port Australia couldn't afford to run. The moment it turned a profit, Australia said, "We want it back." And now, two of the world's most powerful nations are locked in a standoff over a single port in the middle of nowhere. Here's the story nobody is telling you completely. Picture this. It's 2015. A small, cash-strapped government in Australia's remote Northern Territory is drowning in debt. And sitting right at the edge of its coastline is a port that should be valuable, but isn't. The Port of Darwin. Located at the very top of Australia. Closer to Jakarta and Singapore than it is to Sydney or Melbourne. Positioned right along some of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. The sea routes connecting the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, carrying trillions of dollars in global trade every single year. On paper, this port should have been a gold mine. In reality, it was a money pit. The infrastructure was decades old. The shipping channels weren't deep enough for modern cargo vessels. Freight volumes were embarrassingly low. Every year it operated, it cost the Northern Territory government money it simply didn't have. The territory itself is enormous, bigger than France and Germany combined, but home to fewer than 300,000 people. No major financial industry, no manufacturing base, just mining, cattle stations, and a port that wasn't working. So the government did what governments do when they're desperate. They put it up for sale. More than 60 companies from across the world threw in bids. Infrastructure funds, logistics giants, sovereign wealth vehicles. They all saw what the local government had missed. Darwin wasn't just a struggling port. It was a strategic gateway to the fastest-growing economic region in human history. The winner? A Chinese private company called Landbridge Group. Landbridge offered a price that stunned even the officials running the auction. And they walked away with a 99-year lease, a deal reviewed by Australian federal authorities, assessed by national security agencies, and approved by cabinet. Without a single formal objection. Not one. Think about that. A 99-year lease on critical port infrastructure handed to a Chinese company. And it barely made the evening news. Because in 2015, nobody saw it as anything other than a routine commercial transaction. China was Australia's largest trading partner. Chinese investment was flowing into Australian agriculture, mining, property, and energy. The idea that this deal would one day become one of the most politically explosive issues in the country would have seemed almost laughable. But the world was about to change. Fast. After the deal closed, Landbridge didn't hold a press conference, didn't make grand announcements. The company just got to work, and the work was enormous. Darwin Port needed a complete overhaul. Shipping channels were dredged deeper to handle larger modern vessels. New berths were constructed, cargo handling systems were modernized, cold storage facilities were installed, opening doors for Northern Territory farmers and cattle producers to export directly to Asian markets. The workforce expanded. Local contractors were hired. For the first time in years, the community around the port felt something real was happening. According to figures reported in Australian media, Landbridge's total investment surpassed $1 billion Australian dollars over the decade following the lease. $1 billion. Into a facility that no Australian investor had been willing to touch. And it worked. Freight volumes climbed. New shipping routes were established. Mining companies gained competitive logistics options. Agricultural exporters found new pathways to Asian buyers. And then, in the 2025 fiscal year, for the very first time in its history, Darwin Port turned a profit. A Chinese company had walked into a failing, underfunded, commercially abandoned port, spent a decade and $1 billion rebuilding it from the ground up, and delivered results. Under any normal reading of how investment is supposed to work, that is a success story. Instead, the moment the profit numbers landed, Australia started talking about taking it back. And that timing is not a coincidence. To understand why a profit announcement triggered a political crisis instead of a celebration, you need to understand what happened to the world between 2015 and 2025. Because the world changed in ways that made the Darwin deal look very, very different from how it had looked at signing. The first turning point came in 2020, when Australia called for an independent international investigation into the origins of COVID-19. Beijing's response was swift and deliberately painful. China imposed targeted trade restrictions on Australian exports one by one. Barley, hit with massive tariffs, locked out of Chinese markets. Wine, coal, timber, lobster, beef. Sector after sector disrupted. Billions of dollars in losses, communities and industries scrambling to find alternative buyers that simply didn't exist at comparable prices. The message was unmistakable. China was willing to use trade as a political weapon, and it was effective. Those tensions eased eventually, after a change of government in Canberra and 2 years of diplomatic repair work. But the damage was done. Australia had seen firsthand exactly how vulnerable it was to economic pressure from its largest trading partner. And that experience accelerated an uncomfortable national rethink. At the same time, the security environment in the Indo-Pacific was transforming rapidly. China's military had expanded substantially. Its assertiveness in the South China Sea had grown. The relationship between Washington and Beijing had hardened into something that looked increasingly like structured long-term rivalry. Australia responded. In 2021, it announced AUKUS, the landmark security partnership with the United States and the United Kingdom, built around the commitment to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. This wasn't just a defense procurement decision, it was a declaration. It told the whole region which side of the great power divide Australia had chosen, and Darwin became central to all of it. Rotational U.S. Marine deployments near Darwin became permanent. Tyndall Air Base, just down the road, was upgraded to handle advanced American aircraft. The city's military significance, already meaningful, was amplified dramatically. And suddenly the port looked completely different. Not because the port itself had changed. It was still handling containers, bulk cargo, and livestock shipments. No military function, no surveillance equipment. Nothing had physically changed at the facility. But its location, a few kilometers from an expanding American military presence, in a city that had become a critical node in U.S. Pacific strategy, meant that the political optics of a Chinese company sitting on a 99-year lease there had become deeply, uncomfortably, politically untenable. In geopolitics, how things look often matters just as much as what they are. The 2025 federal election changed the public conversation entirely. Darwin Port had been hovering in the background of Australian political debate for years. A 2021 federal review examined the lease. A 2023 national security assessment looked at the arrangement again. Neither review found concrete evidence of security breaches. Neither identified legal violations. Neither produced intelligence showing that the port had been used to surveil U.S. military movements or interfere with Australian defense activities. But here's the thing. Neither review put the issue to rest either, because the concern was never really about proven wrongdoing. It was about possibility, about what could hypothetically happen, about what a Chinese-operated facility next to an American military hub might mean in a future crisis. That kind of concern is almost impossible to refute with evidence, because the evidence would only arrive if the feared scenario actually materialized. By election time, the question of foreign control over strategic infrastructure had become a genuine wedge issue. Both major parties, Labor and the Coalition, were competing to sound tougher. Darwin Port was an irresistible symbol, specific, tangible, geographic. After the election, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese traveled to Darwin and made his government's position public. His administration was seriously considering reacquiring the port. He framed it as a matter of national interest, not as a response to any proven wrongdoing, but on the principle that strategic infrastructure of this kind should not remain under foreign ownership. Let that sink in. The Australian government was not accusing Landbridge of fraud. It was not presenting evidence of espionage. It was not claiming the lease terms had been violated in any way. The The argument being made openly, publicly, was simpler. We want this asset back, and we believe the national interest justifies getting it. Now, on one angle, that's a coherent position. The 2015 deal was made in a completely different strategic environment. Governments should be able to adapt policy when the world changes. But from another angle, there's a problem, and it's a glaring one. When the port was failing, when it was hemorrhaging public money, when no Australian investor was willing to touch it, it wasn't a national security priority. It was a liability. It was something to be handed off to whoever would take it. The moment it turned profitable, the moment Landbridge's decade of investment finally paid off, it became a strategic asset worth fighting over. Several prominent economists and policy analysts across the political spectrum have pointed to that sequence with undisguised frustration. If Landbridge had kept losing money year after year, would any Australian government be spending public funds to get it back? That question doesn't have a comfortable answer. China's response was measured in tone, unmistakable in meaning. The Chinese ambassador to Australia, Xiao Qian, issued a public statement with careful, precise language. If the lease were terminated unilaterally, China would take steps to protect the legitimate rights and interests of its companies. Not aggressive, not theatrical, but absolutely clear. Beijing's formal argument centers on one principle: the sanctity of contracts. The lease was awarded through a transparent international bidding process. Over 60 companies participated. Australian federal authorities ran a proper review. Security agencies were consulted. Cabinet approved it. Landbridge invested $1 billion on the basis of that approved legal agreement. To cancel it a decade later, not because the operator violated its terms, but because political circumstances had changed, would set a precedent that Beijing considers genuinely dangerous. And here's where the story becomes much larger than Darwin. Chinese companies have deployed capital into infrastructure on every inhabited continent. Ports in Greece, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Djibouti. Mining operations across Africa and South America. Energy networks threading through Central Asia. Telecommunications infrastructure on multiple continents. The total scale runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars. Every single one of those investments was made against a specific assumption: that contracts signed in good faith would be honored, that approved investments would be respected. That success wouldn't itself become the trigger for expropriation. If governments can walk away from long-term agreements with Chinese operators, the moment those investments prove commercially successful, everything changes. Chinese firms will stop investing in markets they see as politically unreliable, or they'll demand much higher returns to compensate for the elevated risk. Either way, the open, rules-based international investment system, which benefits everyone, takes a serious hit. Beijing is sending a message, not just to Canberra, to every government that has hosted Chinese infrastructure investment. Contracts matter. If they stop mattering, there will be consequences. The economic tightrope. And here is the part of this story that doesn't get nearly enough attention in the political debate. Australia's economic exposure to China is not just significant, it is enormous. And, the gap between the rhetoric in Canberra and the reality in the trade figures is wider than most people realize. China has been Australia's largest trading partner for well over a decade, and it's not close. Iron ore, liquefied natural gas, coal, agricultural products, international education. China accounts for a proportion of Australian export revenue that would be almost inconceivable in most comparable economies. Iron ore alone tells the whole story. The deposits beneath Western Australia's Pilbara region generate tens of billions of dollars every year. The overwhelming majority flows to Chinese steel mills. No alternative market exists, or is anywhere close to existing, that could absorb that volume at comparable prices. For all the public talk about diversification, the fundamental economic reality has changed far less than the political speeches suggest. And behind the scenes, the people who understand this best are genuinely worried. Because China doesn't need military action or formal sanctions to inflict economic pain on Australia. Its toolkit is far more subtle and far more effective. Administrative delays at Chinese customs, increased inspections on Australian imports, informal guidance to state-owned enterprises to source from Brazil or Africa instead of Australia, targeted anti-dumping investigations, gradual procurement shifts for iron ore. None of these are dramatic. None require a press conference. Collectively, they can be devastating. Australia already experienced this between 2020 and 2023. Beijing's trade restrictions cost Australian exporters billions. Barley farmers locked out of their biggest market. Wine producers scrambling for alternatives. Coal, lobster, timber, disrupted for years. Some sectors never fully recovered. The prospect of deliberately triggering a repeat of that, this time as a direct, calculated response to Australian government action, is not something that serious policymakers in Canberra treat lightly. And yet, the security pressures are real. Alliance expectations from Washington are real. Public opinion is real. The national security debate is real. Australia is caught between two gravitational forces pulling in opposite directions. Its economic lifeline runs through Beijing. Its security anchor is in Washington, and Darwin Port is exactly where those two forces are colliding. Inside the Australian government, the debate is more nuanced than the headlines suggest. Two schools of thought are competing in Canberra. The first says, sovereignty must come first. Australia's critical infrastructure, ports, power grids, telecommunications, should be under Australian or Allied ownership. Full stop. The cost of reclaiming the port, financial and diplomatic, is simply the price of a policy mistake made a decade ago. Better to pay it now than to carry an untenable arrangement indefinitely forward. The second school says slow down. It accepts the security concern. It agrees that greater scrutiny of foreign investment is warranted going forward. But it warns against revoking a legally binding lease without cause. That action sends a message to every foreign investor, not just Chinese ones, that Australian contractual commitments are conditional. It undermines the credibility of Australian commercial law, and it invites economic retaliation at the worst possible moment. Meanwhile, Washington is watching. And American diplomatic messaging has been clear. The U.S. would view Australian reacquisition of Darwin Port favorably. Having a Chinese-operated commercial facility adjacent to U.S. Marine rotational forces is a persistent source of discomfort in Pentagon planning rooms. For Canberra, that creates its own kind of pressure. Alliance solidarity is not abstract. It's expressed in specific decisions on specific questions. Whatever Australia ultimately decides, it will set a precedent, not just for how Australia handles Chinese investment, but for how democratic governments everywhere navigate the increasingly fraught collision between commerce and national security. Because in 2015, a deal like Darwin Port was just business. In 2025, that same deal is a flashpoint. Here's the fundamental truth sitting underneath everything in this story. In 2015, Darwin Port was a problem nobody wanted. A drain on public finances, a liability, a facility that a struggling government was practically begging someone to take off its hands. A Chinese company came forward, paid generously, invested heavily, worked patiently for 10 years, and turned that liability into something valuable. Under any ordinary reading of how investment and commerce are supposed to work, that's a success story. But the world doesn't run on ordinary readings anymore. Not when the investor is Chinese. Not when the asset sits beside an American military hub. Not in the middle of a decade that will shape the global order for generations to come. Darwin Port has become, in miniature, every unresolved tension of the world we're living in. The collision between globalization and sovereignty. The gap between commercial law and national security. The impossible complexity of being a smaller country caught between two superpowers pulling in opposite directions. And whatever happens next in Darwin, it will be watched closely. Not just in Canberra and Beijing, but in every capital city where governments are quietly facing the same impossible question. What happens when the deal you made in a desperate moment becomes a liability in a dangerous moment? There's no clean answer. But there is a warning embedded in this story that every government should hear. Strategic geography doesn't change. The value of critical assets doesn't disappear. And the decisions made in moments of financial desperation will always have to be reckoned with on someone else's timeline, under someone else's conditions. Darwin Port was built in one world, and it's being fought over in another. The real question isn't who owns the port. The real question is, who gets to write the rules? If this story revealed something that the mainstream headlines aren't telling you, about how global power actually moves, about how commercial deals quietly become geopolitical weapons, about how the decisions of yesterday shape the crises of today, then this is exactly the channel you need in your feed. Every week we go deep on the stories behind the stories, the economic forces, the political calculations, the decisions being made right now that will shape your world for the next decade. Hit subscribe, because the next story, it's already unfolding. And trust me, you're going to want to understand it before everyone else does.